For 400 years, the Sassanid Persian Empire stood as the titan of the East. From the mountains of Iran to the fertile banks of the Euphrates, their power was absolute. They had crushed the Romans at several occasions. They had conquered nations. Their kings, the Shahan Shahs, ruled from the White Palace of Ctesiphon, believing their throne was eternal. To them, the deserts of Arabia to the south were nothing but a wasteland, a graveyard of sand inhabited by scattered tribes, unworthy of their attention. But in the year 633 AD, everything changed. The tribes were no longer scattered. They were united under a single banner of Islam, and they were looking north. In Medina, Caliph Abu Bakr made a decision that would alter the course of history. He decided to challenge the superpower. But to fight an empire of millions, he needed a general who could defy the impossible. He chose a man who had never known defeat, a tactician who saw the desert not as a barrier but as a weapon, a warrior who had broken 9 swords in a single battle. He chose Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah. What followed was one of the most brilliant military campaigns in human history. In just 12 short months, Khalid would lead his small army of 18,000 men against the colossal might of Persia. From the iron chains of Kazima to the blood-soaked river of Ullais, from the masterful double envelopment at Walaja to the impossible night raids of the Euphrates, he would strike with the speed of lightning and the force of a thunderbolt. This is not just a story of battles. This is the story of how the map of the ancient world was rewritten in a single year. Prepare yourself. This is the complete, uninterrupted story of the Rashidun army conquest of Iraq. Before we begin this journey, if you appreciate the effort to bring this history to life, please like this video and subscribe to Historic War Lens. Hit the bell icon so you are the first to witness our upcoming Syrian campaign. Share this saga with others so the legacy of these Islamic heroes is never forgotten. The year is 633 AD. The Arabian Peninsula has been pacified. The fires of the Ridda Wars have been extinguished in the blood of the Garden of Death. For the first time in history, the tribes of Arabia stand united under a single banner. But peace is not in the nature of empires. To the east, casting a long shadow over the desert, lay a titan, the Sassanid Empire, Persia. For 400 years, they had been one of the 2 superpowers of the world, locking horns with Rome in a war that spanned centuries. They possessed vast wealth, advanced technology, and armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. To them, the Arabs were nothing. They were seen as lizards-eaters, primitive, a nuisance on the border, not a threat. The Persians believed that the desert was a wall that protected them. They believed no army could cross it and survive. But they had never met a man like Khalid ibn al-Walid. In April 633, the Caliph Abu Bakr gave the order that would change the history of the world forever. He did not order Khalid to guard the borders. He ordered him to invade. Khalid marched north with 18,000 men. His target was the city of Ubullah, the great port of the Persian Empire at the head of the Persian Gulf. But standing in his way was a man who personified the arrogance of the Sassanid state, Hormuz. He was the military governor of the frontier district, a man of immense wealth and noble blood. He viewed the Arabs with open contempt. History tells us he was a tyrant. He was so oppressive that the locals had a saying, more hateful than Hormuz. Hormuz commanded the frontier army. These were not the chaotic tribal levies Khalid had fought in Yamama. This was a professional imperial war machine. They wore heavy steel helmets, chainmail hauberks that reached their knees, plate armor on their arms and chests. They were the cataphracts, human tanks of the ancient world. When Hormuz heard that a small Arab force was approaching, he didn't feel fear. He felt insulted. He immediately gathered his army, heavily outnumbering Khalid, and marched south to a place called Kazima. He intended to crush these desert raiders before they could even touch Persian soil. He wanted to teach them a lesson in hierarchy. But Hormuz made a fatal calculation. He assumed Khalid would fight like a barbarian, charging headfirst into the strongest point of the enemy line. He did not realize he was facing the greatest military tactician of the age. Khalid knew he could not fight the Persians in a direct trial of strength. His men were lightly armored. They had simple swords and leather shields. If they stood toe-to-toe with the heavy Persian infantry, they would be ground to dust. So, Khalid decided to use his enemy's greatest strength against him. The Persians were heavy. They were slow. Their supply lines were long. Khalid was light. He was fast. He moved on camels, and his men were used to the brutal heat of the desert. Khalid sent scouts ahead. He knew Hormuz was marching to Kazima. So instead of meeting him there, Khalid changed direction. He marched his army away to a different location called Hufir. Hormuz arrived at Kazima and found nothing. The desert was empty. Enraged and hearing that Khalid was at Hufir, Hormuz ordered his massive, heavy army to pack up and march again. They marched south under the blistering sun, weighed down by 30 kilograms of iron and steel. They reached Hufir, exhausted, expecting a battle. But Khalid was gone. His scouts had alerted him. As soon as the Persians got close, Khalid simply packed up and marched back to Kazima. It was a game of cat and mouse, but Hormuz was not the cat. Hormuz was furious. He could not let these raiders escape. His pride would not allow it. So he ordered his men to march back to Kazima. Imagine the state of the Persian soldiers. They had marched back and forth across the desert for days. They were dehydrated. Their shoulders ached from the weight of their armor. Their morale was sinking with every step. Khalid had not yet drawn his sword, and he was already winning. Finally, the two armies met at Kazima. Khalid had arrived first. This was crucial. He had taken the high ground. More importantly, he had secured the water springs. When the Persian army arrived, they were thirsty, tired and dusty, and now they had to fight for the right to drink. Hormuz deployed his army for battle, and here we see the detail that gave this battle its name. The Persian officers, realizing that their men were exhausted and fearing that they might flee, gave a chilling order. They ordered the men in the front ranks to link themselves together with heavy iron chains. 5 to 10 men were shackled together at the ankle. In Persian military doctrine, this was a symbol of courage. It was a message to the enemy. We are an iron wall. We will never retreat. We will stand or we will die. It was meant to be a show of strength, but to Khalid ibn al-Walid, looking down from the ridge, it looked like a death sentence. He realized that the enemy had just voluntarily removed their ability to maneuver. They had anchored themselves to the slaughterhouse floor. Before the general charge, Hormuz rode out. Despite his exhaustion, he was a proud warrior. He called out for a duel, the Mubarizun tradition. He shouted, "Man to man, where is Khalid?" Khalid rode out to meet him. Whatever else he was, Hormuz was a skilled fighter. He dismounted his horse, challenging Khalid to fight on foot. Khalid obliged. They circled each other in the sand, the two commanders, the future of the invasion resting on their blades. They locked swords. Khalid struck. Hormuz parried. It was a stalemate, but Hormuz had no intention of fighting fair. Before the battle, he had placed a group of his best assassins in the front row of the Persian line. He had given them secret orders. At the moment Khalid locked blades with him, Hormuz gave a signal. Suddenly, the assassins broke ranks. They charged toward the duel, intending to mob Khalid and kill him instantly. It was a disgraceful act of treachery, a violation of the sacred rules of war. Khalid was trapped. He was wrestling with Hormuz, and half a dozen assassins were sprinting toward his unprotected back. But in the Arab lines, a warrior named Makal ibn al-Ashar was watching. He saw the trap spring. Like lightning, Makal galloped forward. He reached the melee just seconds before the assassins. With a roar, he cut down two of them, buying Khalid a fraction of a second. That was all Khalid needed. He overpowered Hormuz. He grappled him to the ground, and with a single brutal motion, he ended the governor of the frontier. Khalid stood up, bloodied, over the body of his enemy. He looked at the charging assassins and then at the Persian army. He raised his sword, and the Muslim army charged. The death of Hormuz shattered the Persian morale, but they could not run. The Muslim attack was ferocious. They hit the Persian line like a hammer. Usually, when an army breaks, the soldiers scatter. They run. They live to fight another day. But the front lines of the Persians were chained. As the panic set in, men tried to flee, but they jerked against the iron shackles of their dead comrades. If one man fell, he dragged four others down with him. If one man tried to run, he was held in place by the corpse of his brother. The iron wall became a tangled mass of screaming men, tripping over each other, unable to lift their shields, unable to escape. It was a massacre. The Muslim warriors moved through the tangled lines, finishing the job. The desert sand turned to a slurry of mud and blood, just as it had in the Garden of Death. The chains, meant to ensure victory, had ensured total annihilation. By sunset, the Battle of Chains was over. Thousands of Persian soldiers lay dead in the sand, bound together in iron for eternity. Khalid captured the camp. The booty was immense: weapons, gold, horses, and armor unlike anything the Arabs had ever seen. Khalid sent the war booty back to Medina, along with the captured elephant of Hormuz. When the people of Medina saw the chains and the weapons, they realized something terrifying and wonderful. The superpower was vulnerable. But Khalid did not celebrate. He knew this was only the border guard. Hormuz was just a governor. Behind him lay the emperor. Behind him lay the main field armies of the Sassanid Empire. They would not make the same mistake again. They would not underestimate him again. The year is 633 AD. The Arabian Desert, once a silent void on the map of great empires, has erupted. In our last episode, we witnessed the unthinkable. At the Battle of Chains, Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, shattered the frontier army of the Sassanid Persian Empire. He took a force of lightly armed desert tribesmen and dismantled a heavily armored imperial war machine. The Persian governor, Hormuz, lay dead in the sand, and his elite soldiers, who had chained themselves together in a misguided display of arrogance, were slaughtered where they stood. For the emerging Muslim caliphate in Medina, it was a miraculous victory. It proved that the giant could bleed. But for the Sassanid Empire, the defeat at Kazima was not a mortal wound. It was an insult. News of the disaster rode swiftly north, carried by terrified survivors on foaming horses. It crossed the fertile plains of Iraq, past the great zigzagging canals of the Tigris and Euphrates, all the way to the imperial capital, Ctesiphon. The sprawling metropolis, with its towering white palace, was the beating heart of one of the world's two superpowers. Here, the defeat of Hormuz was met with stunned disbelief, followed instantly by incandescent rage. The Persian emperor realized that these desert nomads were no longer mere raiders. They were an invasion force, and the empire's response would be swift, brutal, and overwhelming. The Sassanid war machine began to turn. The emperor did not just want to defeat Khalid, he wanted to erase him. Orders were dispatched to assemble a massive new army. The gathering point was the great city of Ullais. Situated near the head of the Persian Gulf, Ullais was the jewel of the frontier, a massive commercial port known as the gateway to India. It was incredibly wealthy, heavily fortified, and crucial to the empire's economy. To command this vengeance force, the emperor chose a man named Karin. Karin was everything Hormuz had been, and more. A high-ranking nobleman, a decorated general, and a man ablaze with the desire to restore Persian honor. He arrived at Ullais to find a city in chaos. The ragged survivors of the Battle of Chains were pouring in, telling nightmarish tales of the Muslims' speed and ferocity. Karin rallied these broken men, integrating them into his fresh legions. The army Karin assembled was terrifying. It was larger than the force Khalid had just destroyed. It was equipped with the finest steel cuirasses, heavy shields, and deadly horse archers. Karin's strategy was simple. He knew Khalid was somewhere to the south, likely resting and dividing the spoils of Kazima. Karin would march out, use his superior numbers to crush the Arabs against the desert, and send Khalid's head back to Ctesiphon in a basket. The Sassanid giant had awakened, and it was hungry, but Khalid ibn al-Walid was not resting. One of Khalid's greatest gifts as a commander was his intelligence network. His scouts were everywhere, ghosts in the dunes, watching the roads, infiltrating the markets of the border towns. Before Karin's army had even finished assembling at Ullais, Khalid knew they were there. Most commanders, having just fought a grueling battle against superior odds, would have retreated into the deep desert to recover. They would have drawn the enemy away from their supply lines. Khalid did the opposite. He knew that time favored the Persians. Every day he waited, Karin's army grew stronger. Khalid realized the most dangerous course of action was also the only path to victory. He had to strike immediately. He had to hit Karin before the Persian general was ready to move. The order was given. The Muslim army, still tending their wounds from the Battle of Chains, mounted their camels and horses. They moved with that terrifying, characteristic speed that defined the early Muslim conquests. They bypassed strongpoints, ignored the beaten paths, and surged north toward Ullais like a desert wind. General Karin was stunned. His scouts reported a massive dust cloud approaching rapidly from the south. The Arabs were attacking him. Karin scrambled to deploy his army outside the walls of Ullais. He chose a battlefield near a major river, historically identified as a large canal of the Euphrates, known locally as the River of Blood. Karin, perhaps overconfident in his heavy infantry, made a critical tactical choice. He positioned his army with their backs to the river. In ancient warfare, this was sometimes done deliberately. The theory was that if soldiers had no avenue of retreat, they would fight with the desperation of doomed men. It was the same psychological logic as the chains in the previous battle. The Persian line was magnificent. Rank upon rank of glittering steel, discipline, and imperial power. Karin took the center. On his wings were two other mighty generals, Kabad and Anushajan. Against them stood Khalid's force. Smaller, austere, their armor dust-caked, their only adornments their weapons and their unshakable faith. Khalid surveyed the Persian line. He saw the river swirling behind them. He saw a general who had trapped his own army. Karin had built a cage for his men. Khalid intended to lock the door. The battle opened in the traditional manner of the era, the challenge of champions. The Persian commanders, eager to prove their individual valor and avenge Hormuz, rode out from the ranks. Karin himself, along with his wing commanders, Kabad and Anushajan, bellowed challenges to the Muslim line. It was a moment of high theater. The roaring armies fell silent. Khalid ibn al-Walid did not hesitate. He rode out to meet Karin in the center. Two of Khalid's toughest lieutenants rode out to meet the wing commanders. The duels were savage and shockingly brief. Khalid, a master swordsman in the prime of his life, parried Karin's opening strikes. With a movement too fast for the heavy Persian armor to counter, Khalid closed the distance. History records that within moments, Karin, the emperor's vengeance, lay dead at Khalid's feet. Simultaneously, on the flanks, the other two Persian generals were cut down by their Muslim opponents. In the span of a few heartbeats, the entire high command of the Persian army had been wiped out. A collective gasp, followed by a ripple of paralyzing terror, went through the Persian ranks. They had not yet cast a spear, and their leaders were gone. Khalid raised his bloodied sword and gave the signal. The Muslim army surged forward as one body. The Persian army, leaderless and demoralized, buckled under the initial impact. Discipline evaporated into panic. The instinct to flee took over. But there was nowhere to go. Behind them roared the deep waters of the Euphrates Canal. The front ranks tried to push back, but the rear ranks were pressed against the muddy banks. The Battle of River ceased to be a battle. It became a compression. The Muslim army, operating like a precision instrument, relentlessly pushed the disorganized mass of iron and flesh toward the water. Thousands were cut down on the banks. Thousands more, weighed down by their heavy armor, were shoved into the river and drowned. The waters of the canal turned red, carrying the broken might of the empire downstream toward the Persian Gulf. It was total annihilation. Khalid had not only defeated the reinforcements, he had captured Ubullah, the great port of the empire. The booty was staggering: gold, fine weapons, and Arabian horses that would fuel the next stage of the campaign. The gate to Iraq had been kicked wide open. But Khalid knew that Ctesiphon would not take this lying down. The sleeping giant was now fully awake, and it was screaming. The next army they sent would not be led by a mere governor or a disgraced general. The true war had only just begun. May 633 AD. The plains of Mesopotamia are burning. In the span of a few short weeks, the unthinkable has happened. Two imperial armies of the Sassanid Empire have been annihilated. The Battle of Chains left their frontier guards shackled in the sand. The Battle of River turned the Euphrates red with the blood of their heavy infantry. For the Emperor Yezdegerd III in Ctesiphon, this was no longer a border raid. It was an existential crisis. The barefoot lizard-eaters of the desert, as the Persian court arrogantly called them, had kicked down the door to the empire's breadbasket. The humiliation was unbearable. The strategic situation was critical. If Khalid ibn al-Walid was not stopped now, the road to the capital would be wide open. But empires do not fall easily. The Sassanid superpower, though exhausted by years of war with Rome, still possessed vast resources. The emperor ordered a full mobilization. He would not send just another army, he would send two. He would overwhelm the desert commander with sheer numbers and sophisticated strategy. He would crush Khalid between the hammer and the anvil. As the Arab poet later wrote, "The lion does not sleep when the jackal enters his den. He wakes and he kills." This is the story of the Sassanid Empire's greatest attempt to destroy the sword of Allah. And it is the story of how Khalid ibn al-Walid responded with a tactical masterpiece, a maneuver so complex and so deadly that military historians compare it to Hannibal's triumph at Cannae. Welcome to the Battle of Walaja. The Persian strategy was sound. It relied on their greatest advantage, manpower. The emperor dispatched a massive new army under the command of Andarzagar. Andarzagar was not a court politician like Hormuz. He was a veteran governor of the frontier, a man who grew up fighting border skirmishes. He knew the Arabs. He respected their speed, and he intended to neutralize it. His orders were to march to Walaja, a location where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers narrow, creating a natural choke point. But Andarzaghar was only the bait. A second army, led by the legendary General Bahman, was marching south from Ctesiphon to join him. Bahman commanded the heavy imperial reserves, the iron core of the Sassanid military. The plan was simple. Andarzaghar would dig in at Walaja and lure Khalid into a stalemate. Once Khalid was pinned down, Bahman's army would arrive from the north, flanking the Muslims and crushing them against the river. It was a classic divide and conquer strategy. Khalid's intelligence network, the Eyes of the Desert, picked up the movement of these two leviathans. Khalid realized immediately that he was walking into a trap. If the two Persian armies united, their combined mass would be unstoppable. He had to move. Khalid gathered his commanders. The accounts tell us he looked at them and said, "We must strike the first enemy before the second can tie his sandals." Khalid ignored the second army. He pushed his men to the breaking point, racing across the scorching terrain to intercept Andarzaghar at Walaja before reinforcements could arrive. The Muslims arrived to find Andarzaghar waiting for them. The Persian general had chosen his ground well. He had deployed his massive force, estimated at 30,000 to 50,000 men, in a wide plain, with a ridge of hills behind them to protect their rear. Andarzaghar was confident. He had the numbers, he had the terrain, and he knew help was on the way. He looked at the smaller, dust-covered Muslim force and reportedly said to his officers, "Let them come. They are like flies flying into a web. The more they struggle, the tighter we shall bind them." The battlefield of Walaja was a flat plain, bordered by ridges. It was perfect for the heavy Persian infantry to form their shield wall and grind the lighter Arab force to dust. But Khalid saw something Andarzaghar did not. To the Persian general, the ridges behind the battlefield were a safety measure, a wall to protect his back. To Khalid, they were a weapon. The night before the battle, under the cover of a moonless sky, Khalid pulled off one of the most audacious gambits in military history. He took his two best cavalry commanders, Suwaid and Rafe, and gave them 4,000 horsemen, nearly half his cavalry strength. His orders were specific and terrifying. They were to ride wide, far around the Persian flanks, using the darkness and the gullies of the terrain to stay invisible. They were to position themselves behind the ridges at the rear of the Persian army. And then they were to wait. Khalid told them, "Do not show yourselves. Not when the battle starts, not when the swords clash. Wait until the enemy believes he has won. Wait for my signal." By dawn, the 4,000 horsemen had vanished into the landscape. To the Persians looking across the field, Khalid's army appeared dangerously small. His center looked thin, his flanks looked weak. It was exactly what Khalid wanted them to see. The sun rose over Walaja. The drums of the Sassanid army began to beat, a slow, rhythmic thunder that shook the ground. Andarzaghar ordered the advance. Thousands of Persian heavy infantrymen, clad in chainmail and carrying tall rectangular shields, began the march. The Battle of Walaja had begun. The collision was deafening. The lighter Muslim infantry, armed with spears and swords, met the heavy Persian wall. For hours, the battle was a stalemate of brutality. The Persians fought with the discipline of a superpower. They pushed forward, step by bloody step, their sheer weight driving the Muslims back. Khalid, commanding from the center, watched the lines carefully. He could see the exhaustion setting in on his own men. He could see the Persian confidence growing. It was time for the second phase of his plan. Khalid issued a counterintuitive order. The center must retreat. This was not a rout, it was a controlled withdrawal. The Muslim center began to give ground, stepping back, fighting, and stepping back again. To Anbar, watching from his command post, this looked like the beginning of the end. The Arabs were breaking. Their line was bending backward into a crescent shape. The scent of victory is a powerful intoxicant. Anbar abandoned caution. He ordered his wings to swing inward, pouring everything he had into the center to shatter the Muslim line once and for all. The Persian army compressed. They crowded together, shoulder to shoulder, pushing into the concave pocket Khalid had created. They were so focused on the men in front of them, they forgot to look at the hills behind them. The trap was set. The enemy was fully committed. The Persian army was now shaped like a dense ball, pushing deep into the Muslim formation. Khalid raised his sword. The signal was given. From behind the ridge, a sound emerged that froze the blood of the Persian rear guard. Not the sound of wind, but the thunder of 16,000 hooves. Suwaid and Rafe, the hidden commanders, crested the hills. They did not pause. They charged down the slope like an avalanche of steel. Allahu Akbar! The cry rang out from the rear. The Persian soldiers in the back ranks turned around, eyes widening in horror. They expected safety. They found heavy cavalry charging at full gallop. The impact was catastrophic. The Muslim cavalry smashed into the exposed rear of the Sassanid army. At the exact same moment, Khalid halted his retreating center. The broken Muslim infantry suddenly planted their feet, locked their shields, and pushed back with renewed fury. The trap snapped shut. The double envelopment was complete. The Persian army was surrounded on all sides. In front, the Muslim infantry. Behind, the Muslim cavalry. On the flanks, Khalid's light horsemen closed the circle. It was a tactical miracle. A smaller force had completely encircled a larger one. Chaos erupted inside the Persian ranks. The men in the center couldn't swing their swords because they were pressed so tightly against their comrades. The men in the rear were being cut down by lances they couldn't see coming. Panic is contagious. It spreads faster than fire. Anbar tried to rally his men, shouting, "Stand fast! Break through!" But his voice was lost in the screams of the dying. The disciplined imperial army dissolved into a terrified mob. It became a slaughter. The Battle of Walaja effectively ended, and the massacre of Walaja began. Historical sources tell us the killing lasted until sunset. The precision of the encirclement meant that very few Persians escaped. Anbar, the man who had boasted of binding the Arabs like flies, managed to break out with a small bodyguard. But his fate was perhaps crueler than his soldiers. He fled into the deep desert, hoping to reach Ctesiphon. He lost his way. The desert, which he had failed to respect, claimed him. He died of thirst, alone in the sands, while his army lay dead at Walaja. The victory was absolute. Khalid ibn al-Walid had destroyed the third Persian army in a row. He had executed a maneuver that military academies would study for 1,000 years. As the dust settled, Khalid stood over the battlefield. The loot was immense: gold, silver, fine armor, and supplies meant to feed the empire. He gathered his exhausted, blood-stained warriors. They were simple tribesmen, far from home, staring at wealth beyond their wildest dreams. But Khalid knew the war was not over. The second army, the one led by Bahman, was still out there. The emperor's rage had not been extinguished. It had been fueled, and just a few days' march away, at a place called Ullais, the Persians were gathering every last man, woman, and auxiliary they could find. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting for survival. May 633 AD. The Sassanid Empire is bleeding. 3 armies sent, 3 armies destroyed. The disaster at Walaja wasn't just a defeat, it was a humiliation. In the capital city of Ctesiphon, the mood has shifted from arrogance to terror. The Emperor, Yazdegerd III, is no longer looking at a border raid. He is looking at the end of his world. But the Persian lion is wounded, not dead, and a wounded lion is the most dangerous creature on earth. The Emperor orders a general levy, a total mobilization. Every man who can hold a spear is summoned. He calls upon the Christian Arab tribes of the region, the Baka, the Ejli, the Rabia, tribes that know the desert just as well as Khalid does, tribes that want revenge for their fallen kinsman at Walaja. He places this massive, vengeful coalition under the command of a new general, Jaban. Jaban is not a politician, he is a survivor, and he has orders to stop the Muslims at a place called Ullais, or die trying. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, is marching to meet him, but Khalid doesn't know that Ullais will not be won with a clever trick. There will be no flanking maneuvers today, no psychological warfare. Ullais will be a meat grinder, a test of pure savage endurance. Before the sunset, Khalid will lead a charge to the enemy that will change the fate of empires forever. Welcome to the Battle of the River of Blood. The location is Ullais, a fertile strip of land sandwiched between the desert and the Euphrates River. The Persian army arrives first. It is a massive force. Historians estimate over 70,000 men when combining the imperial soldiers and the vengeful Arab tribes. They are tired, they are angry, but they are also strangely confident. Why? Because they have the numbers and they are fighting with their backs to the river, but this time they believe it is an advantage. They have nowhere to run, so they must fight. When Jaban, the Persian commander, sees Khalid's army approaching in the distance, he does something that baffles military historians to this day. It is midday. The sun is high. His soldiers are hungry. Jaban looks at the approaching enemy and he orders his men to put down their weapons and eat lunch. He tells them, "Let us dine. The Arabs have marched far. They are tired. They will not attack until we are finished." It was the last meal thousands of them would ever see. The scouts of Khalid ibn al-Walid saw this and reported. They are sitting. They are eating. Khalid doesn't wait for his men to catch their breath. He doesn't wait to form complex lines. He draws his sword, points it at the feasting army, and roars a single command. "Ya Allah, attack!" The Muslim army slams into the Persian camp like a tidal wave. Panic erupts. Persian soldiers scramble to throw aside their plates and grab their swords. General Jaban is screaming orders, trying to form a line, trying to salvage the disaster. But the Sassanids are professionals. Even caught with food in their mouths, they are deadly. They manage to form a shield wall. The Arab tribesmen alongside them fight with a fury born of vengeance. The surprise attack fails to break them. The lines lock together, and the easy victory Khalid hoped for vanishes. What follows is not a battle of tactics, it is a brawl. At Walaja, Khalid won with his mind. At Ullais, he has to win with his hands. For hours, the two armies hack at each other under the blistering sun. The Muslim army is exhausted from the march. The Persian army is fighting for its life. The historians describe the fighting as fierce as any battle in the history of mankind. No one gives an inch. Every time the Muslims push, the Persians push back. The casualties are mounting. The heat is suffocating. Khalid rides up and down the line, throwing himself into the fray, trying to break the deadlock. But the Persian wall holds. These are not the terrified conscripts of the first battle. These are men who know that if they lose here, their families in the cities behind them will be next. It is mid-afternoon. The Muslims are faltering. Khalid sees the exhaustion in his men's eyes. He sees the sheer mass of the enemy. For the first time in the campaign, victory is not certain. He pulls his horse back from the front, turns back to the battlefield. But he is different now. The calculation is gone. Only the killer remains. He charges back into the center. He leads his elite guard, the Mubarizun, directly at the Persian commander Jaban. The ferocity of the attack breaks the stalemate. Khalid fights like a man possessed. Seeing their general's fury, the Muslim army finds a second wind. They push forward, screaming, striking, advancing. Finally, the Persian line cracks. The crack becomes a shatter. The Persian army breaks. They turn and run. The Battle of Ullais was over. 70,000 enemy soldiers lay dead, either on the field or in the canal. General Jaban escaped, but his reputation was destroyed. It was a massacre, but it was also the hardest fight of Khalid's life. He had fought the Romans, he had fought the rebels, he had fought the tribes. But standing over the silent battlefield, looking at the mountains of Persian dead, Khalid paid his enemy the ultimate tribute. He turned to his commanders and admitted, "At the Battle of Mu'tah, I broke 9 swords in my hand, but I have never met an enemy like the Persians, and among the Persians, I have never met an enemy like the army of Ullais." This was the breaking point for the Sassanid Empire. They had tried tactics, they had tried numbers, they had tried coalition warfare. Nothing worked. Khalid ibn al-Walid had proven that he was not just a tactician, but a force of nature, a man who would go to any length to secure victory. Back in Medina, the Caliph Abu Bakr received the news of the victory and the carnage. He sat in the mosque, holding the letter. He looked at the people around him and delivered a quote that sums up the legacy of the sword of Allah. "Women will no longer be able to give birth to the likes of Khalid ibn al-Walid." The road to the heart of Iraq is now open. The Persian field armies are shattered. But the prize, the great city of Hira, the capital of the Arab Christians and the jewel of the Euphrates, still stands. Hira is a fortress city. It has high walls, deep moats, and palaces filled with gold. The governor of Hira thinks he can hide behind his walls. He thinks Khalid does not know how to conduct a siege. He is wrong. Khalid is coming, and he is bringing the river of blood with him. In the history of warfare, there are conquerors who destroy, and there are conquerors who build. May 633 AD. The campaign in Iraq has been a whirlwind. In just a few short months, Khalid ibn al-Walid has dismantled the frontier defenses of the Sassanid Empire. From the chains of Kazima to the blood-stained river of Ullais, the message has been sent. The Arabs are no longer mere raiders, they have become a formidable force. But winning battles in the open desert is one thing, taking a fortified city is another. The army of the Rashidun now stands before Hira. This was not a village. Hira was the capital of the Lakhmid kingdom, the Arab Christian kings who had ruled this land for centuries as vassals of Persia. It was known as the City of Palaces, a place of white citadels, lush gardens, and immense wealth. It was the jewel of the Euphrates. To the Sassanid emperor, Hira was the shield that protected the imperial capital, Ctesiphon. If Hira fell, the road to the heart of the empire would be wide open. The defenders of the city looked out from their high walls. They had heard the rumors of the river of blood. They were terrified, but they were about to learn something new about the sword of Allah. They knew his sword was sharp. They did not yet know that his justice was equally precise. This is the story of how Khalid ibn al-Walid brought the first great city of Iraq under the banner of Islam, not just by the sword, but by the wisdom of statecraft. Welcome to the Conquest of Hira. Khalid's approach to Hira was unique. He did not march his entire army on foot. Instead, he utilized the boats captured at Ullais. The heavy equipment and the infantry sailed up the Euphrates, while the cavalry rode alongside the banks. It was a display of overwhelming confidence. The Persian governor of Hira a nobleman named Kazwin attempted to stop the Muslims outside the city. He sent his son forward with the cavalry to halt the advance. It was a foolish mistake. Khalid's vanguard, led by the legendary Muthanna ibn Haritha, crushed the intercepting force. The governor's son was killed in the clash. When the news reached Governor Kazwin, his spirit broke. Realizing he could not face the wolf of the desert in open battle, he fled the city across the river, abandoning the people of Hira to their fate. The people of Hira were now alone, but they were not defenseless. Hira was unique in its layout. It wasn't just one city behind one wall. It was a collection of 4 massive fortified citadels, essentially 4 fortresses in one. The White Palace, the Grey Palace, the Palace of the son of Mazin, and the Palace of Ibn Bakila. The Arab chieftains of the city retreated into these 4 fortresses, locked the gates, and prepared for a siege. They believed Khalid would tire of the walls. They believed the Persians would send help. They were wrong on both counts. Khalid arrived. He saw the layout immediately. He did not mass his army in one place. He divided his forces into 4 distinct corps. He assigned a commander to each palace, surrounding them simultaneously. The order was simple. Invite them to Islam. If they refuse, offer them the jizya, protection for tax. If they refuse that, only then do you fight. This was the discipline of the Rashidun. They were not barbarians at the gate. They were disciplined liberators offering a choice. The siege began. At the White Palace, the defenders foolishly rained arrows down upon the Muslim troops. Khalid's patience was short. He ordered his archers to return fire. The Muslim archers, veterans of the Ridda Wars, were deadly accurate. A storm of arrows swept the ramparts of the White Palace, forcing the defenders to hide. Then the Muslims stormed the gates, breaching the outer perimeter. The same scene played out at the other 3 palaces. The palace of Ibn Bakila tried to hold out, but the Muslims breached their defenses within hours. The leaders of Hira realized a terrifying truth. The walls could not save them, and no Persian army was coming to save them. The empire had abandoned them. One by one, the cries of defiance from the palaces turned into calls for parley. The monks and priests of the city cried out from the walls, "O Arabs, we surrender, we seek peace." Khalid immediately ordered a ceasefire. This is a crucial moment in history. The river of blood had shown Khalid's capacity for wrath against combatants. But at Hira, as soon as the sword was dropped, the mercy of Islam took over. Not a single civilian was harmed. No houses were looted. The markets were left untouched. Khalid demanded only one thing. The leaders of the 4 palaces must come out and negotiate. The gates opened. The chieftains of Hira walked out to meet the conqueror. Among them was an ancient man, reported to be over 100 years old. His name was Abdul Masih. He was a Christian Arab of great wisdom and renown. Khalid ibn al-Walid, seated in his command tent, looked at the old man with curiosity. The dialogue that followed has been preserved by historians as a testament to the wit and wisdom of both men. Khalid looked at the frail elder and asked, "Where do you come from, Sheikh?" "I come from the womb of my mother." Khalid smiled at the clever answer. He asked again, "Where are you right now?" "I am standing upon the earth." "I know that. I mean, in what land do you dwell?" "In a land that consumes its dead." Khalid was impressed by the old man's philosophical mind. He then asked him a question about the future. "Tell me, have you seen war or peace?" "I have lived long enough to see the people of this land living in such peace that a woman could travel from Hira to Syria with a bowl of gold, fearing nothing but God. But now, I see only ruin. The ruin comes to those who resist the truth. O Sheikh, I invite you to Islam. If you accept, you are our brothers. If not, then pay the jizya and you shall be under our protection. But if you refuse..." The old man looked at Khalid. He saw the strength in the general's eyes, but he also saw honor. Abdul Masih replied, "We do not wish to fight you. We are not a people of war. We will pay the jizya, we will keep our religion, and you will protect us." And so, the Treaty of Hira was signed. This was the first formal treaty of tribute in the history of the Islamic conquest of Iraq. The people of Hira agreed to pay 190,000 dirhams annually. In exchange, Khalid guaranteed their safety, their property, and the freedom to practice their Christian faith. It was a masterstroke. Khalid had secured a base of operations, a source of funding, and a buffer zone, all without destroying the city. With Hira secured, the Muslim army marched into the city. They did not march as looters, but as a government. Khalid stayed in Hira for a year, consolidating his gains. He organized the administration of the region. He ensured that the farmers were treated fairly, knowing that they were the backbone of the land's wealth. He appointed governors and judges, establishing the justice of the caliphate in a land that had known only the tyranny of emperors. But Khalid knew the Sassanids were watching. From Hira, he dictated letters to the Persian satraps, the governors of the remaining provinces. These letters are among the most famous documents in military history. They were not diplomatic pleasantries, they were psychological thunderbolts. One letter read, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, from Khalid ibn al-Walid to the rulers of Persia. Peace be upon him who follows the guidance. I invite you to Islam. If you refuse, then pay the jizya in submission. If you refuse even this, then do not blame anyone but yourselves. For I bring against you a people who love death, just as you love life." The conquest of Hira sent a shockwave through the ancient world. The Arabs were no longer just desert warriors. They were now the masters of the Euphrates. The jewel had been taken. The year is 633 AD. The whirlwind of the desert has swept through southern Iraq. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, has done the impossible. He has shattered the frontier armies. He has turned the Euphrates red at Ullais. And with the wisdom of a statesman, he has secured Hira, the jewel of the Euphrates, through peace and treaty. But for Khalid, Hira was not the end. It was the base. To the north lay the true prize, Ctesiphon, the imperial capital of the Sassanid Empire. But blocking the road to the capital stood a fortress of immense power, Anbar. Anbar was not just a city, it was the empire's armory. It was the logistical hub where the Persians stored their grain and their weapons. Its name in Persian, Firuz Shapur, meant victorious Shapur. It was surrounded by high walls and, more importantly, a deep, wide moat filled with the rushing waters of the Euphrates. The Persian governor, Shirzad, looked at his defenses and smiled. He believed no army could cross that moat under fire. He believed the Arabs, with their light cavalry, would break themselves against his walls like water against a rock. But Shirzad made a fatal error. He thought he was fighting a conventional war. He did not realize that he was facing an army that possessed the deadliest archers in the world, and a commander who saw obstacles not as walls, but as puzzles waiting to be solved. Welcome to the Siege of Anbar, also known as the Battle of the Eyes. The Muslim army marched north from Hira. When they arrived at Anbar, they found the city shut tight. The Persian defenders were positioned on top of the ramparts. They were confident. They stood carelessly on the walls, looking down at the Muslims, jeering at them. Between the Muslims and the walls lay the moat, deep, wide, and impassable without boats or a bridge. Khalid ibn al-Walid rode forward to inspect the defences. He saw the problem immediately. If he tried to build a bridge, his men would be slaughtered by Persian arrows. If he tried to swim the moat, they would be vulnerable. Most generals would have ordered a long siege, starving the city out for months. But Khalid did not have months. He knew that every day he wasted was a day the emperor used to gather a new army. He returned to his lines. His commanders looked at him, expecting an order to camp and wait. Instead, Khalid looked at his archers. These were not ordinary bowmen. Many of them were from the tribes of Yemen and the desert, men who had hunted game in the wild since they were children, men who could hit a moving target from the back of a galloping horse. Khalid gave an order that was cold, precise, and purely military. He did not order a volley of suppression. He ordered a volley of precision. He told his archers, "Do not waste your arrows on their shields. Do not aim for their chests. Aim only for their eyes." 1,000 Muslim archers stepped forward. They stood just within range. They planted their feet. They drew their bows. On the walls, the Persian soldiers were still watching curiously, expecting a chaotic charge. They had their visors up. They were looking at the enemy. Then, the air hissed. In a single coordinated moment, a cloud of arrows flew upward. It was not a random spray. It was a guided storm. Historical accounts, including those of Ibn Kathir and al-Tabari, record the chilling result of this volley. The arrows did not hit the stone walls. They found their mark. Cries of agony erupted along the ramparts. Soldiers clutched their faces. The lucky ones were killed instantly. The unlucky ones were blinded. It is reported that in that single hour, 1,000 eyes were lost. The garrison of Anbar was thrown into absolute panic. This wasn't warfare. This was impossible marksmanship. The defenders threw themselves flat on the floor of the ramparts. No one dared to peek over the wall. To look at the Muslim army was to lose your sight. The Muslims gave the battle a name that day. They called it Dat al-Uyun, the Battle of the Eyes. Khalid had achieved his first objective. He had suppressed the walls. The Persian archers were terrified to return fire. But the moat remained. The enemy was blinded, but the water was still deep. Khalid needed to cross now, while the panic was fresh. He didn't have time to cut down trees for timber. He didn't have boats. He looked at his supply train. He saw the old, weak camels, the animals that were too old to carry heavy loads, brought along for food or minor tasks. Khalid made a decision that showed his ruthlessness in logistics. He ordered the slaughter of the old camels, but they were not to be eaten. He ordered his men to throw the carcasses of the animals into the moat at a single narrow point. It was a gruesome bridge, but an effective one. Pile after pile, the moat was filled. The water level rose, but the solid mass created a causeway. While the Persian defenders were still cowering behind their battlements, afraid to show their faces, the Muslim infantry charged. They ran across the bridge of flesh and bone. They reached the base of the wall. Ladders went up, and suddenly the untouchable fortress was breached. Governor Shirzad realized the situation was hopeless. His men were blinded. The moat was crossed. The sword of Allah was at his gate. He sent a messenger to Khalid, offering to surrender. But Shirzad had a condition. He wanted to leave the city with his garrison and return to Ctesiphon in safety. Khalid agreed, but with a strict stipulation. You may leave with your lives, but you leave with nothing else. No gold, no weapons, no treasures. Shirzad accepted. The gates opened. The Persian garrison marched out. But as they left, the Muslims noticed something. They were wearing heavy robes, looking bulky. Khalid stopped them. He ordered them to shake out their robes. Hidden inside were valuables, gold cups and silks. Khalid could have executed them for breaking the terms, but he held to his word of safety. He simply confiscated the loot, stripped them of their armor and horses, and sent them walking into the desert towards Ctesiphon in disgrace. He took the city without a massacre. He took the supplies without burning them. And most importantly, he showed the people of Anbar that while his bow was deadly, his word was iron. Anbar had fallen. The Battle of the Eyes became a legend in the military camps of the Rashidun. It proved that this army was not just a force of religious zeal, it was a force of professional excellence. The accuracy of the archers at Anbar served as a warning to every garrison commander in Iraq. You are not safe behind your walls. Khalid now controlled the Euphrates, but as he rested in Anbar, reports came in from the desert. To the south, at an oasis called al-Tamr, a massive gathering of Arab Christian tribes and Persian auxiliaries was forming. Their leader, a man named Akka, was mocking Khalid. He was telling the Persians to stand back so he could crush the Arabs himself. Akka did not know who he was dealing with. He wanted a fight. Khalid would give him one. But it wouldn't be a battle of armies. It would be a lesson in humility, delivered by Khalid's bare hands. The year is 633 AD. The land of Iraq is trembling under the hooves of the Rashidun cavalry. In the previous episodes, we witnessed a campaign of unprecedented speed and brilliance. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, crushed the Sassanid frontier armies at the Battle of Chains. He navigated the treacherous Euphrates at the Battle of the River. He lured immense imperial armies into a masterful double envelopment at Walaja, and he broke the spirit of the empire at the blood-soaked field of Ullais. But Khalid is not just a destroyer, he is a strategist. We saw him secure the great city of Hira through diplomacy, establishing the first capital of Islamic Iraq without shedding innocent blood. And most recently, at the Siege of Anbar, we saw the terrifying discipline of his archers in the Battle of the Eyes, proving that no wall was high enough to protect the enemies of the new state. Khalid now controls the Euphrates River Highway. The Sassanid capital, Ctesiphon, to the north, is trembling. The Persian Emperor, Yazdegerd III, is desperately trying to raise new armies from the east. But as Khalid rests his army in Anbar, a new threat emerges. Not from the civilized cities of the river, but from the harsh, unforgiving desert to the west. Intelligence reports reach Khalid's command tent. The routed Persian garrisons and the vengeful Arab Christian tribes, the same tribes defeated at Ullais, are regrouping. They are gathering at a strategic oasis that serves as the gateway between the desert and the fertile lands of Iraq. A place known for its lush palm groves and a mysterious fortified monastery. They are gathering at al-Tamr, the spring of dates. Khalid knows he cannot march north to the capital, leaving such a massive threat on his desert flank. The sword of Allah must swing west, back into the sands that birthed him. Welcome to the fortress of the monks. al-Tamr was a jewel in the desert. Located several days' march west of Anbar, it was a vital trading hub where the nomad met the merchant. It was defended by a strong fortress, garrisoned by Sassanid imperial troops under a Persian commander named Mihran. But augmenting this garrison was a massive gathering of auxiliary Arab Christian tribes, the Taghlib, the Iyad, and the Namir. Their leader was a formidable Arab chieftain named Akka ibn Qais an-Namari. Akka was a proud man, a desert warrior of high repute. He harbored a deep, burning resentment against Khalid for the defeats inflicted upon his kinsmen in earlier battles. Historians record a fascinating interaction between the Persian commander, Mihran, and the Arab chieftain, Akka, as Khalid's army approached. It is a testament to the lethal arrogance that often precedes a downfall. When news arrived that Khalid was days away, Mihran began organizing his Persian heavy infantry for a standard defensive battle. Akka intervened. He looked at the Persian commander with disdain. "Mehran, these attackers are Arabs. We are Arabs. We know their ways. We know how to fight them better than you Persians ever could. Leave them to us." It was a staggering display of hubris. Akka was claiming he alone could stop the man who had just destroyed 5 imperial armies in 4 months. The Persian commander, Mehran, was an experienced soldier. Perhaps he genuinely believed Akka, or perhaps, more cynically, he was happy to let the treacherous Bedouins absorb the first blow of Khalid's charge. Mehran replied calmly, "Very well, they are your kin. The glory shall be yours. My Persians will stand in reserve at the fortress. If you need us, we are there." And so it was decided. The Persians withdrew to the safety of the fortress walls, leaving Akka and his tribesmen drawn up in battle formation outside the oasis. Akka positioned himself proudly at the front center of his army. He was eager for personal glory. He wanted the world to know that he was the Arab who stopped the sword of Allah. He had no idea that he was about to become the victim of one of the most extraordinary feats of individual warrior skill in military history. The Muslim army arrived at Ain al-Tamr in mid-633 AD. Khalid ibn al-Walid surveyed the battlefield. He saw the strange deployment. The Persian regulars were nowhere to be seen. Only the tribal auxiliaries were lined up for battle, with Akka ibn Qais sitting prominently on his horse at the front, almost inviting a challenge. Khalid understood the situation immediately. He realized that this entire army was held together only by the arrogance and reputation of its leader. In the traditions of pre-Islamic Arabia, battles often began with duels between champions. Akka likely expected Khalid to send forth a champion, or perhaps ride out to issue a formal challenge himself. But Khalid had evolved beyond the simple tribal warrior. He was a general who sought swift, decisive victory with minimal loss of Muslim life. Khalid made a split-second decision that no one on that battlefield expected. He did not order a general charge. He did not call for archers. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the commander-in-chief of the Muslim armies, spurred his horse forward alone. He rode straight at the center of the enemy line, straight at Akka. It happened incredibly fast. Before Akka's bodyguards could react, before Akka himself could even raise his weapon to defend himself, Khalid was upon him. Islamic historical sources are clear on this point. Khalid did not use his sword. In a display of raw, terrifying physical strength, Khalid leaned over from his saddle, grabbed the surprised Akka by his armor, and ripped him bodily off his own horse. Like a lion snatching prey, Khalid dragged the struggling chieftain across the saddle of his own horse and turned back towards the Muslim lines. The entire sequence took perhaps a minute. By the time Khalid dumped the captive Akka at the feet of his guards, the battle was essentially over before it had begun. The psychological shock was catastrophic. The tribesmen watched their invincible leader get snatched away like a naughty child. Their morale evaporated instantly. Panic spread like wildfire through Akka's army. Without a leader, the tribal coalition disintegrated. They turned and fled in total disarray before the main Muslim army had even drawn their swords. The Muslims pursued, cutting down many of the fleeing warriors and taking hundreds of prisoners. Meanwhile, inside the fortress, the Persian commander Mehran watched in horror from the walls. He had expected a long, drawn-out battle between the Arab tribes. Instead, he saw Akka's army vanish like smoke in the wind. Mehran realized his mistake. By letting Akka fight alone, he had exposed his own greatest weakness: fear. Seeing the unstoppable momentum of the Muslims and the complete collapse of their allies, the Persian garrison's nerve failed them. They abandoned the walls and retreated into the inner citadel of the fortress. Khalid immediately surrounded the fortress of Ain al-Tamr. The siege was short. The defenders knew no help was coming. They were deep in the desert, isolated from the empire. The psychological weight of Khalid's presence was too much. Within days, the gates were opened. The garrison surrendered to the judgment of the conqueror. Khalid's justice was swift. Akka ibn Qais, the arrogant chieftain who had sought glory, was brought before Khalid. He had taken up arms against the state after his kinsman had already been defeated. He was executed for his rebellion. The Persian garrison was taken captive. But as the Muslim soldiers secured the fortress, they discovered something within its walls that they did not expect. Inside the fortified complex of al-Tamr was a large Christian monastery. When the Muslim soldiers entered, they found the doors locked. Upon breaking them open, they discovered a strange sight. Inside were 40 young men. Their heads were shaved in the manner of monks, and they were intently studying ancient religious texts, seemingly oblivious to the war raging outside their doors. They were students, novices dedicated to learning in this desert sanctuary. When the soldiers asked them who they were, they replied simply, "We are hostages of God," meaning they had dedicated their lives to religious seclusion. Khalid ordered that these students be treated well. According to the customs of war at the time, they were taken as captives to Medina. While this may seem harsh to modern sensibilities, history shows that this moment was a seed planted for the future glory of the Islamic civilization. These young captives were brought into the Muslim society of Medina. They and their children embraced Islam. They exchanged the isolation of the desert monastery for the vibrant intellectual life of the burgeoning Islamic state. From the descendants of these 40 hostages of God, found at al-Tamr, came some of the greatest scholars and leaders in Islamic history. Among their descendants was Muhammad ibn Ishaq, the author of the Sirah Rasul Allah, the first major biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Also among their descendants was the brilliant military commander Musa ibn Nusayr, who would one day lead the Muslim armies across North Africa and into Spain. The Battle of Ain al-Tamr was not the largest battle of the campaign, but it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Khalid had proven that he was not just a master of the open plain or the river siege. He was the master of the desert as well. He had neutralized the threat on his western flank. He had broken the coalition between the empire and the desert tribes. The road to Ctesiphon seemed clearer than ever. But as Khalid secured the oasis, a desperate rider arrived from the deep south. He carried a message that would force Khalid to make an impossible choice. Another Muslim army, led by the companion Iyad ibn Gham, was surrounded and facing annihilation in the far deserts of Arabia at a place called Dumat al-Jandal. The message was simple: save us, or we are lost. Khalid could march north to glory in the Persian capital, or turn south into the abyss of the desert to save his fellow Muslims. For the sword of Allah, there was only one choice. By the summer of 633 AD, Khalid, the sword of Allah, was the undisputed master of the Euphrates Valley. He had shattered the Sassanid frontier defenses. He had secured his flanks. The path to Ctesiphon, the glittering capital of the Persian Empire, lay open before him. But while Khalid was securing victory after victory in Iraq, another Muslim army was facing disaster hundreds of miles to the south. When Caliph Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, launched the campaigns, he did not just send Khalid. He had dispatched another prominent companion, Iyad ibn Ghanem, to subdue the rebellious tribes in northern Arabia. Iyad's target was the ancient oasis city of Dumat al-Jandal. It was a vital crossroads of trade, protected by the formidable fortress of Marid, a castle said to be unconquerable. For months, Iyad ibn Ghanem had besieged the city, but his army was too small, and the defenses of Marid were too strong. The besiegers had become the besieged. They were trapped in the harsh desert, running out of supplies and facing a massive coalition of Christian Arab tribes determined to wipe them out. As Khalid rested his troops at Ayn al-Tamr, a lone rider, exhausted and covered in dust, rode into his camp. He carried a letter from Iyad ibn Ghanam. The historical accounts tell us the message was brief, a cry of desperation from one Muslim commander to another. From Iyad to Khalid, we are surrounded. The enemy is vast, and our situation is dire. If you do not come to us quickly, you may find only our bones. Khalid ibn al-Walid faced an impossible choice. To the north lay glory, the Persian capital, and the completion of his mission. To the south lay a perilous march into the unforgiving desert to rescue a stalled campaign. History records Khalid's immediate response. There was no hesitation. The unity of the Muslims was paramount. He turned his back on the Persian capital and ordered his army to prepare for the desert. Welcome to Great Rescue Mission. The distance between Ayn al-Tamr in Iraq and Dumat al-Jandal in northern Arabia is roughly 300 miles across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, the Great Nafud Desert. A normal caravan might take 2 weeks to make this journey. Iyad ibn Ghanam did not have weeks. Khalid knew that speed was the only way to save Iyad. He left a strong garrison to hold his gains in Iraq and took his most mobile, battle-hardened veterans. This march was a grueling test of endurance. They moved swiftly across the scorching sands, riding day and night with minimal rest. It was a logistical nightmare, pushing men and horses to their absolute breaking point. The historical sources highlight the intense discipline of Khalid's troops, a discipline forged in the battles of Walaja and Ullais. While Khalid marched, the situation at Dumat al-Jandal was reaching a breaking point. The defenders of the city were a massive coalition of Christian Arab tribes, the Kalb, the Ghassanids, and others. They were led by 2 formidable chieftains who hated each other. The first was Uqaydir, the historical ruler of Dumat. He was an experienced, older man who had dealt with the rising power of Islam before. The second was Judi ibn Rabi'a, a powerful, arrogant tribal warlord who had brought thousands of fresh warriors to reinforce the city. When news reached them that Khalid ibn al-Walid was seen marching south, the 2 leaders reacted very differently. Uqaydir was terrified. He knew Khalid's reputation. He told Judi, "Listen to me, I know this man. No army has ever defeated him. If Khalid is coming, our only chance is to remain behind the walls of Marid and wait him out in the desert heat." But Judi ibn Rabi'a was proud. He looked at his massive army, which vastly outnumbered the surrounded force of Iyad ibn Ghanam, and he scoffed at the old ruler's caution. "Let him come. We will crush Iyad first, and then we will crush Khalid when his army is exhausted from the desert." The arrogance of Judi won out. The coalition army abandoned the safety of their fortress walls. They deployed outside the city, determined to finish off Iyad's beleaguered force once and for all. They had no idea how fast the sword of Allah was moving. Iyad ibn Ghanam's soldiers were exhausted, outnumbered, and losing hope. For months they had stared at the imposing stone walls of Marid, and now they found themselves with their backs to the desert. They saw the massive enemy coalition deploying against them for a final assault. The tribes of Kalb, Bara, and Ghassan had gathered in their thousands, sensing blood. The Muslim soldiers tightened their grips on their swords, saying their final prayers, prepared to sell their lives dearly for the sake of their faith. But just as the enemy commanders gave the signal to advance, a low rumble began to shake the ground, not from the fortress, but from the northern horizon. The defenders paused. A massive cloud of dust rose against the blue desert sky, blocking out the sun like an approaching storm. Khalid had arrived. He did not just arrive, he arrived with the precision of a master chess player. Unknown to the enemy, Khalid had sent swift riders ahead to Iyad's camp days before, coordinating their movements down to the hour. As Judi ibn Rabi'ah's army moved to attack Iyad's front, fully committing their forces to crush the southern Muslim line, they left their rear completely exposed. It was the fatal mistake Khalid had been waiting for. With a roar of Allahu Akbar that shook the dunes, Khalid's fresh cavalry smashed into the exposed rear flank of the coalition army. It was a perfect pincer movement executed on a massive scale. The Arab coalition force, so confident moments before, was instantly thrown into absolute chaos. Panic rippled through their ranks faster than the sword. They were being attacked from two sides by two separate Muslim armies acting as one single, lethal organism. The soldiers of Iyad, seeing their brothers arrive, found a new surge of strength and charged forward to meet the enemy. The fighting was fierce but brief. The coalition warriors found themselves trapped in a crushing vice. They could not move forward against Iyad, and they could not retreat from Khalid. The psychological shock of Khalid's sudden appearance, the man they thought was hundreds of miles away in Iraq, shattered the enemy's morale instantly. The coalition army broke. In the chaos, the arrogant warlord Judi ibn Rabi'ah, who had boasted he would defeat both Muslim armies, found himself isolated. He was surrounded and captured alive, his pride stripped away in an instant. Meanwhile, Uqaydir, the older ruler of Dumat, who had advised caution, had tried to flee before the battle even fully engaged. He knew the wind had shifted, but he could not outrun the reach of the sword of Allah. He, too, was intercepted by Khalid's patrol units, who had cut off the escape routes into the desert. The field army was annihilated. The desert floor was strewn with the wreckage of the coalition. But the massive fortress of Marid, the rebel castle, still stood defiant. The remaining defenders, those lucky enough to escape the pincer, retreated inside the giant stone walls and barred the heavy iron gates. They believed that even Khalid could not breach Marid. It was a fortress that had withstood sieges for centuries. They thought they could wait him out, that the Muslims lacked the heavy siege engines to break stone. But Khalid was not in a mood for a long, drawn-out siege. His army was energized by their lightning march and the swift victory in the field. He knew that momentum was a weapon as strong as iron. He ordered an immediate, overwhelming assault on the fortress gates. The historical accounts state that the sheer ferocity of the Muslim attack was terrifying to behold. Buoyed by the reunification of the two armies, the Muslims stormed the walls with a spiritual intensity that overwhelmed the defenders. The defenders of Marid looked down and saw not a tired army, but an unstoppable tide. Their will crumbled. The gates were breached. The fortress that was said to be unconquerable fell in a matter of hours. The Battle of Dumat al-Jandal was a total victory. The grand coalition that threatened the Muslims in the north was dissolved, their leaders captured, and their stronghold taken. But more importantly, a catastrophe was averted. The meeting between Khalid ibn al-Walid and Iyad ibn Ghanem after the battle was a deeply emotional moment. Iyad was a senior companion, a man of high standing, yet he had been brought to the brink of destruction. Khalid, the later convert but the superior military genius, had marched through hell to save him. When they met amidst the smoke of the conquered fortress, it was not a meeting of rivals, but of brothers. Khalid's willingness to sacrifice his own immediate glory in the rich lands of Persia to save his fellow Muslims cemented the brotherhood that was the bedrock of the Rashidun's success. Khalid now controlled not just southern Iraq, but the vital strategic crossroads of northern Arabia. Dumat al-Jandal was the gateway between Iraq, Syria, and the Arabian Peninsula. By taking it, he had secured his rear completely. His reputation as an invincible commander had now spread deep into the desert tribes of the Kalb and Ghassan. To them, he was no longer just a general, he was a force of nature. He stayed in Dumat al-Jandal for a few weeks, resting his troops who were exhausted from the desert march and organizing the administration of the region. He distributed the spoils of war and ensured justice was established in the new territory before undertaking the arduous march back to Iraq. But while the sword of Allah was away in the deep desert, his enemies in Iraq began to stir. Intelligence is a fickle thing in war. The Persians and the surviving Arab Christian tribes in the Euphrates Valley received reports that Khalid had marched south. They believed he was gone forever. They thought he was trapped in the endless sands of Arabia, bogged down in a siege at Dumat. Emboldened by his absence, the hyenas began to gather where the lion had left. The routed tribes from previous battles, burning with a desire for revenge, began to reorganize. They did not gather in one place, but formed massive camps at 3 separate locations: Muzaya, Sani'i, and Zumail. They were preparing a massive counterstroke. They planned to strike the isolated Muslim garrisons Khalid had left behind in Iraq, intending to reclaim the land while its protector was away. They believed they were safe. They believed Khalid was hundreds of miles away, occupied with the affairs of the desert. They slept soundly in their camps, confident that the sword of Allah could not reach them. They were wrong. Khalid was returning, and he was moving faster than any army had the right to move. This time, he would not offer them a pitched battle. He would not fight them in the light of day, where they could see him coming. He would strike them when they least expected it, in the dead of night. In the last episode, we saw the sword of Allah, Khalid ibn al-Walid, perform a miracle of logistics. He marched across the deadly Nafud desert, appeared like a phantom at Dumat al-Jandal, and crushed a massive coalition to save his fellow Muslims from annihilation. It was a victory of brotherhood, but in war, every decision has a cost. By leaving the front lines of Iraq to rescue Iyad ibn Ghanem in Arabia, Khalid had left a vacuum. The lion had left the den. For months, the Sassanid Persian Empire and their Arab Christian allies had lived in terror of Khalid. They had seen him break the chains at Kazima, cross the river of blood at Ullais, and capture the fortress of al-Tamr. They believed he was unstoppable, but when news arrived that Khalid had marched hundreds of miles south into the deep desert, a sigh of relief swept through the Persian court at Ctesiphon. They believed the sword was finally gone. They believed he was bogged down in the endless tribal wars of Arabia. They were wrong, but their mistake gave them courage. The remnants of the tribes Khalid had defeated, the Taglib, the Iyad, the Namir, began to whisper among themselves. The shame of their previous defeats burned in their chests. They saw an opportunity. "The man who defeated us is gone," they said. "Only his garrisons remain. If we strike now, we can reclaim our lands." And so they gathered, not in one place, but in 3. Massive armies of vengeful warriors, supported by Persian strategic planners, encamped at Muzaya, Sani'i, and Zumail. They prepared to wipe the Muslim presence off the map of Iraq. They felt safe. They posted their sentries. They sharpened their blades. They slept soundly, confident that the desert separated them from their greatest fear. They did not know that the lion had already turned back. They did not know that Khalid ibn al-Walid does not fight wars like other men. He does not just defeat enemies, he breaks their souls. Welcome to the Triple Night Raids. Tonight, we witness the terrifying precision of the Triple Night Raids. To understand the magnitude of what happened next, we must look at who these enemies were. These were not undisciplined mobs. These were the great Arab tribes of the Euphrates, the Bani Taglib and Bani Bakr. These were proud warrior societies who had served the Persian Empire for generations. Historical accounts, including those of Ibn al-Athir, describe their motivation not just as political but personal. Many had lost fathers and brothers at the Battle of Walaja and Ullais. They were driven by thar, blood revenge. The Persians, ever the puppet masters, organized this resurgence. They instructed the tribes to gather at 3 specific strategic points. First, Madzar. This was the largest concentration, located in the northwestern sector of the frontier. Second, Sassanid, a camp positioned to support Madzar. Third, Dumat, a deep reserve camp. The plan was simple: coordinate these 3 armies to launch a simultaneous assault on the Muslim headquarters at al-Hira. They would overwhelm the garrison Khalid had left behind before he could ever return from the desert. But Khalid's intelligence network was arguably his greatest weapon. Even while he was settling affairs in Dumat al-Jandal, his scouts were riding hard from Iraq. They brought him word of the gathering storm. Khalid's reaction was immediate. He did not rest. He did not wait for the summer heat to pass. He mobilized his army instantly. But Khalid knew he could not simply march back and fight a standard battle. The enemy had had months to prepare. They were numerous and they were dug in. If he fought them in the open day, they might combine their forces into one unstoppable wave. So, Khalid devised a plan that is studied in military academies to this day. He would not attack them as one massive army. He would split his force. He divided his army into 3 corps. The first he commanded himself. The second he gave to the legendary warrior Khalid ibn al-Walid. The third to the capable commander Abu Layla. His orders were strange. He told them, "March by separate routes. Do not be seen together. We will meet at Madzar. We will not meet at dawn. We will not meet at dusk. We will meet exactly at midnight." This was the concept of time on target, a coordination difficulty that even modern armies struggle with. Khalid intended to converge 3 separate armies on a single point, in the pitch black of night, without radios or clocks, guided only by the stars and sheer discipline. It is late at night at Madzar. The enemy camp is sprawling. Thousands of tents dot the landscape. The warriors of the Bani Taghlib are confident. Reports have told them Khalid is still in Arabia, or perhaps slowly marching back. They expect a battle in a week, maybe 2. The fires die down. The sentries, lulled by the silence of the desert, begin to doze. There is no moon to betray the movement on the dunes. From 3 different directions, 3 shadows emerge from the darkness. Khalid, Khalid, and Abu Layla have arrived. They are ghost-like. There are no drums, no battle cries. Not yet. The historical narrations state that the coordination was perfect. As the stars reached their appointed position, the 3 Muslim corps struck simultaneously. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the roar of "Allahu Akbar!" from 3 sides at once. The result was absolute pandemonium. The enemy soldiers woke up to the sound of hooves tearing through their tents. Before they could reach for their swords, the Rashidun cavalry was upon them. It was not a battle, it was a liquidation. The confusion was so absolute that the tribesmen could not tell friend from foe in the dark. Panic spread like wildfire. Men ran into each other, tripped over tent ropes, and were cut down where they stood. Ibn al-Athir writes that the slaughter at Madzar was unprecedented. The surprise was so complete that the enemy never managed to form a single line of defense. The pride of the Bani Taghlib was broken in less than an hour. Those who managed to escape fled into the darkness, running desperately towards the second camp at Sassanid. They thought they could find safety there. They thought the nightmare was over. But Khalid did not stop to loot the camp. He did not stop to celebrate. He looked at his commanders, Khalid and Abu Layla, and gave the order, To Sani! The distance between Muzaya and Sani was not great. The refugees from the first battle arrived at Sani, terrified, screaming that the sword of Allah had fallen upon them from the sky. The commanders at Sani were shocked. They roused their men. They tried to form ranks. They expected Khalid to arrive, perhaps the next morning, after resting his troops. Surely no army could fight a battle, march and fight again in the same night. They underestimated the conditioning of the Rashidun army. These men had just marched across the Nafud desert. A short ride between camps was nothing to them. Khalid did not give the enemy at Sani time to process the fear. Just as the refugees were telling their horror stories, the thundering of hooves was heard again. For the second time that night, the tactic was repeated. Simultaneous convergence. The Muslim army, split again into three, slammed into the camp of Sani from three directions. The psychological impact was devastating. The defenders of Sani saw the broken refugees from Muzaya being cut down, and their hearts failed them. The phantom was real. He was here, and he was not tired. The Battle of Sani was even shorter than Muzaya. The resistance crumbled instantly. The Arab tribes, who had prided themselves on their bravery, found that courage is useless without order. They were scattered to the winds, but the night was not over. There was one camp left, Zumail. The survivors of Sani fled to Zumail, and here we see the true horror of Khalid's psychological warfare. He was herding them. He was letting the terrified survivors run ahead to spread the panic to the next camp, poisoning their morale before his sword even touched them. Zumail was the reserve camp. The warriors there had slept through the night, unaware of the destruction happening miles away. But as dawn approached, the ragged, blooded survivors of Muzaya and Sani began to stumble into Zumail. They brought news of the apocalypse. "Khalid is here," they gasped. "He destroys everything." The commanders at Zumail were paralyzed. They had prepared for a war of maneuvers, for open field battles. They were not prepared for this relentless, sleepless warrior who struck again and again in the dark. Khalid, Kaka, and Abu Layla arrived at Zumail just as the fear was setting in. The pattern was the same. The execution was flawless. 3 sides, 1 signal, total devastation. By the time the sun rose over the horizon of Iraq, 3 massive armies had ceased to exist. In one single night of operations, Khalid ibn al-Walid had dismantled the entire tribal coalition that the Persians had spent months building. The Battle of Zumail was the final nail in the coffin. The sheer number of casualties among the Christian Arab tribes was staggering. This was not just a military victory, it was a message. Khalid sent a clear signal to the tribes of the Euphrates. The Persians cannot protect you, the night cannot hide you, distance cannot save you. The triple night raids stand in history as a unique example of endurance and coordination. To fight 3 distinct battles in 3 different locations within a single operational window is a feat that few generals in history, Napoleonic or modern, have ever replicated. As the smoke cleared over the 3 ruined camps, Khalid reunited his corps. His men were exhausted but victorious. They had secured the flanks of the Muslim conquests once and for all. The surviving tribesmen who escaped that night fled north. They did not stop at their villages. They ran until they crossed the border into the territory of the Roman Byzantine Empire. They brought with them tales of a man who could not be defeated. And now, the board was set for the final confrontation. The Persian Empire was humiliated. The Arab tribes were broken. But now, a new player entered the game. The Byzantine Empire, seeing this rising power on their southern border, decided to intervene. Driven by a mutual fear of the sword of Allah, the unthinkable happened. The 2 superpowers of the ancient world, Rome and Persia, sworn enemies for centuries, decided to join forces. They gathered every soldier they could find. They called upon every surviving tribe. They amassed a colossal army at a place called Firaz. Khalid ibn al-Walid had defeated the Persians. He had defeated the Romans at Mu'tah, but he had never faced them both at the same time. History is often written as a story of binaries: East versus West, Rome versus Persia, cross versus fire. For 700 years, the Roman Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Persian Empire had locked horns in a war that spanned centuries. They were the superpowers of the ancient world, sworn enemies who had spilled oceans of blood to destroy one another. It was said that fire and water could mix before a Roman and a Persian would call each other brother. But in the year 634 AD, the impossible happened. Driven by a terror they could not comprehend, these two titans set aside 7 centuries of hatred. They looked to the south, towards the desert, and saw a force that threatened them both. They saw a man who had never been defeated. They saw the sword of Allah. Welcome to the season finale of the Iraq campaign. We have followed Khalid ibn al-Walid from the very beginning. We watched him break the chains at Kazima. We saw him cross the river of blood at Ullais. We witnessed the miracle of the desert march and the terrifying precision of the triple night raids. By the start of 634 AD, Khalid had virtually dismantled the Persian defenses in Iraq. He had secured the Euphrates. He had crushed the Arab tribal coalitions, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Now he marched his victorious army to the very edge of the frontier. He arrived at Firaz, a strategic border town where the Euphrates River marks the dividing line between the Persian Empire to the east and the Roman Empire to the west. Khalid intended to secure this border and end the campaign. But what he found waiting for him was not a simple garrison. The spies reported movement across the river, not just a few squads, but a leviathan. The Persian garrisons, humiliated by their losses, had fled here. The Arab Christian tribes, the Taghlib, the Iyad, the Namir, burning with revenge after the night raids, had gathered here in their thousands. And most shockingly of all, the Roman frontier garrisons, seeing the Muslims on their doorstep, had opened their gates to their Persian enemies. At Firaz, the world united against the believers. A combined army of Romans, Persians, and Christian Arabs. Historians estimate their numbers were vast. Some accounts say over 100,000, stood ready to crush Khalid's exhausted force of barely 15,000 men. This was to be the final test, the ultimate trap. This is episode 12, the Battle of Firaz. Because this is the battle where the map of the ancient world changes forever. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must look at the sources. Ibn al-Athir and al-Tabari describe this coalition with a sense of awe. This was not a formal treaty signed by Emperors Heraclius and Yazdegerd. This was a desperate alliance of local commanders on the frontier. The logic was simple: survival. The Persian generals were desperate. They knew they could not defeat Khalid alone. They had tried at Chains, at River, at Walaja, and they had failed every time. The Byzantine commanders were pragmatic. They saw Khalid dismantling their neighbor, and they knew they were next. And the Arab tribes? They were the glue. The tribes of Bani Taghlib were the most furious. They had suffered the most during Khalid's night raids at Muzaya and Zumail. Their leaders moved between the Persian and Roman camps, stoking the fires of fear. If you do not stop him here, they warned the Romans, he will be in Syria by the summer. If you do not join us, they told the Persians, you will have no empire left to defend. And so, the unthinkable happened. On the eastern bank of the Euphrates, the banners of the cross were raised beside the banners of the Zoroastrian fire. Roman legionaries in heavy segmented armor stood shoulder to shoulder with Persian heavy infantry in chainmail. On the western bank, Khalid ibn al-Walid stood with his 15,000 warriors. But these were not the fresh soldiers who had marched out of Medina a year ago. These men were exhausted. They had been fighting non-stop for 12 months. Their armor was dented, their swords were chipped, and their faces were weathered by the sun and wind of 1,000 miles. And there was another factor, a test of faith that made this battle unique. It was Ramadan. The month of fasting had arrived. It was January 634 AD. The days were short, but the discipline required was immense. As the Muslim army encamped by the river, many of the soldiers were fasting, abstaining from food and water, despite the looming threat across the water. Khalid looked at the massive host gathering on the opposite bank. He saw the sheer scale of the enemy. A less faithful commander might have retreated. A more cautious general might have called for reinforcements from Medina. But Khalid was the sword of Allah. He knew that victory in Islam never came from numbers. It came from the help of Allah and the strength of the heart. The two armies faced each other across the Euphrates. The river was wide, a natural barrier. The coalition commanders felt secure in their numbers. They held a council of war. Their arrogance had returned. They looked at the small Muslim camp and saw an easy victory. They sent a messenger to Khalid. The message was traditional, a challenge of position. "O Khalid," the messenger shouted across the water, "will you cross the river to us, or shall we cross to you?" This was a critical decision. In ancient warfare, crossing a river in the face of an enemy is suicide. If Khalid crossed, the enemy could attack him while his army was half in, half out of the water. But if he let them cross, he risked being overwhelmed by their sheer numbers on his own side of the river. Khalid consulted his commanders. Men like al-Kakar ibn Amr al-Tamimi and al-Muthana ibn Haritha. Khalid's mind, always sharp, saw the terrain not as it was, but as a trap waiting to be sprung. He looked at the river. If he let the enemy cross, the river would be behind them. If the battle went poorly for the coalition, the river would block their retreat. They would be trapped between the sword of Allah and the deep water. Khalid turned to the messenger and gave his reply, calm, short, and deadly. "Cross to us." The coalition commanders smiled. This was exactly what they wanted. They believed Khalid was afraid to attack. They believed his caution was weakness. They began the crossing. It was a massive logistical undertaking. Bridges of boats were tied together. The Roman engineers, masters of construction, facilitated the movement. For hours, the Muslim army watched in silence. They watched as regiment after regiment of the world's two greatest superpowers poured onto their side of the bank. Some of the Muslim soldiers might have felt a tremble in their hearts. The enemy just kept coming. 50,000, 80,000. Some sources say the number swelled to 150,000. Even if we take the conservative modern estimates of 50,000 to 80,000, the Muslims were outnumbered at least 5 to 1. But Khalid ordered his men to hold their ground. "Let them cross," he said. "Let them all cross." He wanted every single enemy soldier on his side of the river. He did not want a skirmish, he wanted a total victory. By the time the crossing was complete, the coalition army covered the plain of Firaz like a swarm of locusts. They deployed in a massive line. The Romans took the center, their heavy infantry locking shields in the famous testudo formation. The Persians took the wings, their heavy cavalry looming large. The Christian Arab tribes filled the gaps, eager to rush forward and claim the first blood. But there was a flaw in their formation, a flaw that Khalid had anticipated. They were crowded. Because they had so many men, and because the river was at their backs, they lacked depth. They were squeezed together. The different languages, Greek, Persian, Arabic, created confusion in their commands. The Romans didn't trust the Persians looked down on the Arabs. Khalid deployed his 15,000 men with his back to the open desert. He knew his advantage was maneuverability. If things went wrong, he could retreat into the sands where the heavy Romans could not follow. But he had no intention of retreating. He placed his trusty commanders in position. Adi ibn Hatim on the right wing, Kaka ibn Amr on the left wing, and Khalid himself took command of the rear guard, the mobile guard, his elite cavalry reserve. It was now midday. The sun was high. The thirst of the fasting soldiers began to set in. The enemy blew their horns. The ground shook as the massive coalition army began to advance. They expected the Muslims to break. They expected the sheer sight of the united superpowers to terrify these desert warriors. But the Muslims stood like a wall of iron. They recited the takbir, Allahu Akbar. Khalid drew his sword. The trap was set. The river was behind the enemy. The desert was behind the Muslims. The Battle of Firaz, the final and bloodiest confrontation of the Iraq campaign, was about to begin. What happened next would go down in history as one of the most ruthless tactical envelopments ever executed. The sun reached its zenith over the Euphrates. The air shimmered with heat. On one side stood the colossal coalition of Rome, Persia, and the Christian Arab tribes, a sea of iron and silk stretching as far as the eye could see. On the other, the compact, hardened ranks of the Muslims, their backs pressed against the endless, unforgiving desert. The silence broke, not with a shout, but with the twang of bowstrings. The Sassanid archers, renowned for their skill and power, loosed the first volley. The sky darkened as thousands of heavy arrows rained down on the Muslim lines. But Khalid had anticipated this. He had ordered his men to adopt a loose formation, spacing themselves out to minimize casualties from the bombardment. They raised their leather shields, weathering the deadly storm with grim discipline. Then the horns blew. The massive coalition army began to move. The sheer weight of their numbers was terrifying. The heavy Roman infantry in the center marched with the rhythmic, earth-shaking stomp of disciplined legions. The Persian heavy cavalry on the wings thundered forward, the ground trembling beneath their armored horses. The initial collision was deafening. The coalition strategy was brute force. They intended to smash the smaller Muslim army with sheer weight, pushing them back into the desert until they broke and scattered. The fighting was ferocious. Ibn al-Athir describes the scene as a meat grinder. The Roman gladius met the Arab scythe. Persian maces crashed against Rashidun shields. The dust rose so thick it choked the men. For the first hour, the Muslim line buckled under the immense pressure. They were outnumbered at least 5 to 1. Every Muslim soldier found himself fighting 3 or 4 enemies at once. Khalid watched from his command post in the rear. His eyes scanned the battlefield. He saw the enemy committing everything to the center. He saw the Romans and Persians pushing harder and harder, believing victory was imminent. But in their eagerness to crush the Muslims, the coalition made a critical mistake. They were compressing themselves. As they pushed forward, the massive army began to squeeze together. The Romans bumped into the Persians. The Persians crowded the Arab tribes. Their flanks, which should have been wide and enveloping, began to fold inward due to the lack of space. Khalid's eyes narrowed. The enemy had trapped themselves. He turned to his elite reserve, the mobile guard. "Now," he said, "now we end this." Khalid ibn al-Walid split his mobile guard into 2 powerful columns. He took command of the right column himself. He signaled Kaka ibn Amr to coordinate the left. With a roar of Allahu Akbar that cut through the noise of battle, the Muslim cavalry burst from the rear. They did not charge the center. They swung wide, galloping around the crowded, confused flanks of the coalition army. The enemy, fixated on crushing the Muslim infantry in front of them, did not see the doom approaching from the sides. Khalid's cavalry smashed into the exposed rear of the Persian and Roman wings. It was catastrophic. The coalition soldiers in the rear turned to fight, but they were packed too tightly. They couldn't swing their weapons. They couldn't maneuver. The Roman legions, famous for their discipline, found themselves crushed against their Persian allies. The different languages became a curse. Greek commands clashed with Persian shouts and Arabic screams. Panic is a contagion. It started in the rear ranks. "We are surrounded!" came the cry. The soldiers in the front, still fighting the Muslim infantry, felt the pressure from behind. They hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, the Muslim infantry, exhausted, bleeding, fasting, saw their chance. The Muslim line, which had been bending for hours, suddenly snapped forward like a coiled spring. Compressed from the front by the infantry and from the rear by Khalid's cavalry, the massive coalition army lost its cohesion. It became a mob, a terrified, suffocating mob of 100,000 men. And then the realization hit them. The river, the Euphrates, was behind them. Khalid had let them cross for a reason. He had pinned them against the water. As the Muslim vice tightened, the coalition soldiers began to rout. They turned and ran, not to safety, but to the riverbank. What followed was not a battle, but a disaster. Thousands of men plunged into the fast-flowing waters of the Euphrates, desperate to reach the other side. Heavily armored Roman legionaries sank like stones. Persian cavalrymen were dragged down by their own panicked horses. The bridge of boats became a bottleneck of screaming humanity. In their panic, they pushed each other off. The bridge collapsed under the weight. The historians record that the river turned red. The number of drowned exceeded the number of slain by the sword. The Muslims pursued them to the water's edge. Archers rained arrows into the swimming mass. It was a total annihilation. The sources vary on the exact numbers, but they all agree on the scale. Tens of thousands perished that day. It was the single bloodiest day of the entire early Islamic conquests up to that point. When the sun set over Firaz, the united army of the superpowers had ceased to exist. The Romans fled back to Syria. The Persians retreated deep into Ctesiphon. The Arab tribes were shattered beyond recovery. Khalid stood on the banks of the Euphrates, looking at the carnage. He had faced the world, and he had won. And yet, his first act was not to celebrate. It was to break his fast. He took a sip of water from his canteen, thanking Allah for the victory that defied all logic. The Battle of Firaz marked the absolute end of the Persian threat in the Euphrates Valley. In just over a year, Khalid ibn al-Walid had fought 15 major battles. He had never been defeated. He had liberated the Arab tribes, humiliated the Persian Empire, and secured the eastern flank of the rising Islamic State. But while Khalid was victorious in Iraq, the winds of war were blowing from the west. Far away, in the holy city of Medina, Caliph Abu Bakr was not celebrating. He was looking at a map of al-Sham, Greater Syria. He had sent 4 other armies to the Roman front. Great commanders had marched out: Amr ibn al-As, Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan, and Shurabil ibn Hassana. They were facing the full might of the Byzantine Empire, a foe far more organized and dangerous than the crumbling Persians. Reports were coming in of massive Roman gatherings. The Muslim armies in Syria were outnumbered, separated, and struggling to make progress against the fortified cities of the Levant. The success in Iraq was complete, but the war for Syria was just beginning. The sword of Allah rests now at Firaz, but his brothers in Syria are calling for help. In the next episode, we leave the deserts of Iraq. We travel west to witness the opening battles of the Syrian campaign. We will see how Amr ibn al-As and Abu Ubaidah faced the Roman legions for the first time. The stakes are higher. The enemy is stronger. This concludes Season 1 of our early Muslim Wars series, the Iraq campaign. Join us for Season 2, the Conquest of Syria. Thank you for watching this detailed breakdown of the Battle of Firaz. If you enjoyed this season finale, please subscribe to Historic War Lens and hit the bell icon. We rely on your support to continue these productions. Share this video with your friends and family. Let the history of these heroes be known. See you in the next campaign.